Welcome back, and what a delight and an honor to have our good friend with us today, Wallace Henley. I just love this man and what he does and his writings and his perspective. He's Senior Associate Pastor at Houston Second Baptist Church and former White House aide under the Nixon administration. He writes a lot for the Christian Post, and if you don't subscribe, you need to just go to their website and download all of the Wallace Henley articles. And now he's taken on a topic that kind of rings a bell with me in many ways. And the last article is entitled, "The Terrible Logic of Hell." Really? Hey, buddy, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. How are you doing?
Doing good. I just want you to know the fish, the salmon are biting, but there's no Wallace here to catch them.
Shut up. Don't tell me.
I'm just going to have to send you some on dry ice so you know what you're missing up here.
Well, I'll give you my address at the end of the program.
Okay, you're on. Good to see you, bud. Well, listen, I'm so glad you tackled this. What prompted you to take it on?
Well, I'm very concerned about the whole gospel. Our Pentecostal friends talk about the full gospel. I'm concerned for the whole gospel. And the whole gospel is the gospel that's being lost in so much of the Western pulpit today. And that's the gospel of accountability. Now, why is that gospel? We'll talk about that in the program.
You know, if you go back, and I'm sure you have, if you're any kind of a researcher of revivals, you can go all the way back to the great Welsh revivals, bring it forth to Azusa Street and some of the others. They did have a couple of common distinctions. One is they were hellfire and brimstone. It was turn or burn. And the other thing that came as a result of those revival is that truth was reestablished. But we don't seem to be fearing hell, or that there's even one out there to fear.
Well, the problem is the loss of the fear of God, that positive fear of God, which results in a loss of reverence. And this applies for many evangelical churches. I'm stunned sometimes at the fact that people have lost any sense of the sacred and of reverence. All of this goes back to this question of accountability, that I'm accountable to something beyond myself, something that is transcendent. We cannot live whole and complete lives without that sense of accountability. Hollywood makes a parody of those hellfire damnation preachers, but they were the people that God used to lay the foundations for a very healthy society.
This happened, Wallace. How did we not become concerned or even aware of accountability? It would appear that this might be a result of pluralism.
Well, it's a result of pluralism. It's also a result of an extremely indulgent worldview that was built into our culture beginning in the late 1950s. It erupted in the 1960s when people said we have the rights to everything, including anarchy if we want it. And then it was institutionalized in the 70s as great scholars began to write books about parenting and about institutional life and governance and so on. It was embraced in the 1980s. It was advanced in the 1990s. And now it is the law of the land, according to the progressives who say that they don't establish laws, but they want to regulate our lives according to this worldview.
You've hit two words that really ring a bell with me, because I've been talking a little bit about this, and I have to tell you, I'm getting some pushback. The word reverence and the word holiness. It seems to be now that those two words have been almost made liquid so they can mean anything you want it to be. How would you describe them?
Well, this comes again in the context of the relativism of our time, the pluralism of our time, the equivalence of our time. I'll have to chase a rabbit here for just a moment, something that I'm very concerned about, and that was but illustrates the point that I'm making, and that is the Pope's statement last week that essentially makes the Great Commission the equivalent of what ISIS is doing. He even refers to that in trying to defend or to excuse, not excuse, but to show how Christianity and ISIS are just alike, because the gospel in the Great Commission calls on us to go out and make disciples. This cloudy thinking that does not land on absolute truth. Jesus is talking about making disciples. He's talking about the kingdom, which is the kingdom of righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit, not the kingdom of mayhem and murder and madness that we see on the other side. But the equivalency has brought all of this together to say there is no absolute. You just kind of take your opinion and go with it. And oh, by the way, however, if you are a conservative or a member of what is labeled the right wing, your opinion doesn't count. But nevertheless, go sort of nurture it for yourself. I mean, it's just a crazy worldview that is destroying society.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been trying to process that through my mind. Where could they possibly make the justification of evangelism and ISIS? That was a stretch for me. I couldn't process it.
This is the reflection of someone, and I don't mean to be judgmental, but this is the distinction between somebody who knows the Word of God and somebody who knows about the Word of God. A massive distinction. And if I know more about the magisterium, which is that great body of church doctrine, than I know about the direct logos of God, then I will jump to conclusions about the direct word based on that philosophical generalization of the word. So we have to have a complete interaction with the logos itself, not with our doctrinal systems, not with our presupposed views, our creedal systems, but we must have direct encounter and interaction with the word itself.
So how could we possibly fear God and hell if we don't have reverence of God and His holiness?
Well, it comes back to the distinctions between power and authority that I've talked about in a couple of places. Authority is from the higher to the lower. It is granted, and it is granted to those under authority, meaning that the top echelon is absolute of that authority. Power is seized. People conflate God and hell with mere power rather than authority. Authority generates respect. If my boss, Ed Young, says, Wallace Henley, sit on the back row today, then I sit on the back row. If he says, go up on the pulpit and preach, I go up on the pulpit and preach. If he says, sweep the floors, I sweep the floors. He has authority that I respect and that I want to yield to. That's regard. That's reverence. There's something sacred about that relationship. And it points ultimately to God. When you lose that, you lose the concept of authority, the proper authority. All you've got left is mere power. So you say, I'm going to resist that power. This is a God of hell, and I'm going to resist that God. So it's a conflation of raw power, which is indeed the nature of the deity that violent religious people follow, instead of the real God, the God of truth, to whom I want to give an account. I desire to give an account to Him.
We have done a pretty good job bringing people into the church, and I want to be respectful here, but we may even label it as salvation. But at the end of the day, they're not changed, and they're not healed, and they walk away dismayed. So how could they possibly fear a God if they didn't understand Him rightfully in the first place?
Yeah, how can there be a gospel? How can there be good news unless there's bad news? And that's part of our crisis. We don't have any bad news anymore, except that which makes me uncomfortable, and whether or not all my gadgets are working. The bad news is that in any system that is absolute, and in any system that is absolutely righteous, there is also going to be freedom. God is love. If God is love, He's not a rapist. He will not force Himself on us. If God is love, He gives us a choice. If you're going to have a choice in an absolute system, the choices are going to be absolute. They're not going to be between shades of gray. They're going to be good or evil. And God must permit that. There had to be two trees in the garden. It would have been a lot easier had there just been one tree. But there were two trees. And the two trees make us free. And the two trees give us the freedom of choice that enables the response of love. You take away that tree of evil, of the knowledge of good and evil, you take that away, and all you've got is the tree of life. You don't have life. You don't have that healthy balance that is also justice and mercy. There is no meaning without the other.
I got to take a break here, Wallace. Hate to do it, but I got to take a quick break here because you're about ready to jump up and start preaching. I got so much to ask you. When we come back, the Pew Report says 54% of Americans don't believe in hell. And I'm wondering, is the subject of hell being, is it being strategically left out of the gospel message today? In other words, is the pulpit saying it's not popular, I just won't talk about it? We'll be right back with Wallace Henley in just a moment.
I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Okay, we're back with our good friend Wallace Henley. And by the way, wallacehenley.com is his website. There's so much good material there. He's authored Globequake, one of the great books that I refer to often. And of course, his book with God and Churchill, just fantastic research. And that's turned into a movement and a lecture series that he does. But he also writes a lot for the Christian Post. And his latest article is one that you must read and ponder. It's titled The Terrible Logic of Hell. And are we not talking about it today, and why? And how come the Pew Report says 54% of Americans don't even believe there is a hell? Well, let me ask you this, Wallace. Is there a hell?
There is absolutely.
Oop, he froze on us.
It's because there is a system of justice that works in the universe. It works in the physical universe, the moral universe, the spiritual universe, and they're always the counterbalances. One absolutely good, one absolutely evil. We see this in entropy. We see this in the law of gravity.
Okay, we're getting some breaks.
You can have the most wonderful confidence in the world that the law of gravity does not affect you and jump off a building, but you'll find out very quickly it's objective, it's judgmental. And this is the way the universe works, and it works that way spiritually.
One of the big questions that come out of this, how can a loving God send people to hell? How do you answer that as a pastor? We're getting some video breakup here. Oh man, I want these answers. I tell you what, let's see if they can reconnect with him, because we got to get these answers. So while they're going to reconnect with him in just a moment, let me just say, go to wallacehenley.com, and he is at his website. You'll find a lot of these postings. The other thing is, you can go on christianpost.com, christianpost.org.com. Either way, just Google Christian Post. And he writes a lot of articles there. He is spot on. Now, a little bit about Wallace Henley, why we reconnect with him. He is the senior associate pastor at Houston's Second Baptist Church there in Houston, Texas, under the leadership of Pastor Ed Young. Huge church. I don't know. I forget. I think they have a membership beyond 50,000 people that go through their campus in a week. He teaches his Sunday school class midweek, and thousands. I'd like to teach a Sunday school class for 3,000 people. And I realize those numbers are big and they may be significant in some ways, but the end of the day is Wallace is really a terrific guy. He's gone through the test of fire. And before all of that, he worked for a congressman. He was a chief of staff, and then he ended up in the White House under his boss there at the time, and the Nixon administration. And so he writes from experience, and I think his perspective and his research is to be highly respected. If you haven't gotten his Globequake book, let me encourage you, go get it. It's as simple as that. All right, sorry about that, Wallace. Nice to have you back. Anyway, let's come back to the simple question: how does a loving God allow people to go to hell?
A loving God must allow people to go to hell. Anybody who's raised adult children will understand this. There comes a point where always when they're little bitty kids, I want to make all of their decisions for them because I want the very best for them. But I'm raising them to be free. And at some point, I must remove my restraining hand. I must allow them to have the consequences of their behavior. And that's the meaning of love. Love grants freedom, and God is loving. Therefore, God grants freedom. Freedom is meaningless without choice. Choice is meaningless without consequence. Consequence necessitates the opposite of what we might classify as love, because choice allows the person to be free. That's what God has done.
You and I have seen the day where a good fiery sermon about God's love and the consequences of avoiding it, which ends up in hell, brought people out of their pews and they ran to the altar and gave their life to Christ. And not were they not only saved at that moment, they were called into the ministry. That's gone. We just don't see it happening today. So why are pulpits avoiding the subject of hell?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One thing, there's such an abysmal neglect of the Old Testament. Someone would say, well, the doctrine of hell is not really developed in the Old Testament. That's true, but what is developed there is this high level of accountability. Sinners in the hands of an angry God came out of that worldview. And again, Hollywood and the media and the establishments, they love to parody that. But, you know, if someone is jumping off that building I described earlier, I'm going to do everything I can to try to restrain that person from doing that and warn that person about the consequence of that. That's what carried forward in the Great Awakenings. Now, watch this. It moved from the Great Awakenings into the colonial pulpit. And there have been some very extensive studies of this. And it moved from the colonial pulpit into the minds of the founders. And so the founders of our constitutional republic put into the Constitution, into the Declaration of Independence, the whole concept of accountability. Accountability to the people, accountability to one another, checks and balances in the government, and ultimately accountability to the Creator who gave us our inalienable rights. Mm-hmm. That prevailed pretty much until the 1950s, 1960s. We had a group of scholars called the Frankfurt School who began to invade the academic world of the West and eventually came to the United States. They were what we call deconstructionists. And they said words are really meaningless. Ideas are really meaningless. So they set out to deconstruct meaning. And this is part of what has happened in the universities, our academic systems, and hell got caught in that movement. There is no meaning of goodness without evil. We don't understand goodness without understanding evil, any more than we can see the stars in the sky without the deep, dark night of space. It takes both of those dynamics to see the beauty.
Yeah, because what we have here is, as evil as ISIS is, under the theology, it's rewarded with good. And so there's no consequence to the evil of ISIS. Right.
According to the doctrine that there is no hell.
Right.
Which means that there's no justice, you see.
Right. Yeah. So where is this going? How important it is that we bring the subject of hell back into the equation?
If we're going to avoid a slide into anarchy, and the book of Revelation, many other scriptures talk about anarchy that characterized the last days. I believe we've been in the last days since the ascension of Jesus, and I believe that these trends intensify over time. Paul writes to the Thessalonians that there is a restrainer who is holding back this lawlessness, and at some point that restrainer is going to be removed. Now, part of the restrainer, I believe the restrainer is the Holy Spirit, but that restraint system is the truth. As long as the truth is there to warn us, anarchy in a person, in a society, is restrained. You take away that truth, that absolute truth about hell, about accountability, the restraint is removed. Edmund Burke recognized this. G.K. Chesterton recognized this. Malcolm Muggeridge recognized this. Every great writer, T.S. Eliot recognized this. Christopher Dawson recognized. I can go on and on and on with the greatest of thinkers who are not studied in our academic institutions because they don't fit the model that is dictated by the academic establishment.
Boy, you bring up a great point here in the subject and the gospel of accountability, because a lot of churches today just don't have an accountability structure. You have a person who feels like they're called of God to do a church. They surround themselves with like-minded people. They call that an eldership. There's nobody there to oversee and to make really an insightful spiritual judgment.
Well, one of the things that I've learned about my boss, Ed Young, is that he wants people in his executive team who will say no to him, who will speak up to him. That kind of accountability and that kind of system has to be invested in every institution. Otherwise, it's not going to be a heavenly institution. It's going to be a hellish institution. But let's talk for a minute about a brief history, a modern history, if you will, of the pulpit. In the 1940s, we were desperate. We were before God. We were calling out to God. The President of the United States praised himself on national radio at the point of the Normandy invasion. In the 1950s, we're trying to rebuild Western society, all those nations in Europe, as well as replenish our own economy here in the United States. So our focus suddenly turns now to our own rebuilding ourselves. In the 1960s, we're now indulging ourselves, and we're now saying that we want this to be the way things operate forever. And then in the 1970s and 80s, we turn into the therapeutic pulpit. How can we be happier people? And how can our lives be better? That's the theme that I see so often on church signs and billboards. That's the way we get people in. Have a happier life. Have a happier life. Smile more. At some point, we need to have the courage to say, this Sunday, we're issuing a warning. And it needs to be in bold red letters that without Jesus Christ, we are bound for hell. Yeah, he'll make our lives better, but the important thing you need to understand is that there's an accountability that is coming.
Well, that's the big one. It's refreshing. Are you going to turn this into a series?
At some point, I'll turn it into something. I don't know what, but at some point, I'm working on a book. I'm working on a book right now called Destroyers and Deliverers. And we'll trace those across society, across time, historically, who've been the great destroyers of civilization, and in contrast, the deliverers that God raises up. I got this idea working on the Churchill book because Hitler and Churchill were so perfectly juxtaposed. Here was the representative of evil, absolute evil, Adolf Hitler. Here was a representative. He may have been drawn into it kicking and screaming. He was not an evangelical good man, so to speak.
Gotta go.
He was the representative.
Gotta go, brother. Thank you. Love you, man. And
Okay,
I can't wait to talk to you about that one. Keep up the good work. Let's stay in touch, pal.
Thanks, man. God bless.
All right, God bless. See you next time on Focus Today.